There is a half-second in my life I still turn over sometimes on a quiet shift, the way you touch a bruise to make sure it has finally stopped hurting. And it happened on the long lawn at Harrogate on the first cool Saturday of September, in front of 40 children eating too much cake, and not one single moment of real danger. I want to say that plainly before I tell you anything else about it, because the story that eventually reached the newspapers left that part out entirely, and the part they left out is the only part that actually matters. My name is Corin Vale. I have served the household guard of the Kingdom of Eldermoor for 16 years, the last 9 of them on what we call close family detail, which is a formal way of saying that my job is to stand near the people I am sworn to protect while they do ordinary things, walk a garden, eat a meal, watch their children play, and to notice, without ever once looking as though I am noticing, the exact moment an ordinary thing stops being ordinary. It is a strange kind of watching. You spend most of a career hoping you never have to use it, and then one afternoon, over a rose pergola and a bounce of overtired arms, you use it anyway, and you are wrong, and you have to live with having been wrong in front of everyone who loves the 2 people you were wrong about. The occasion was the little Lark's garden party, which Queen Consort Morwenna had quietly funded and hosted every September for 9 years. Since not long after Prince Bram's own arrival into the family, though she had never once put her name on the invitations or allowed the charity's newsletter to credit her by more than a generous patron of the household. Little Lark's was a modest nursery trust on the poorer side of the river, the kind of place that fixed roofs before it bought new toys, and once a year Morwenna opened the East Wing's long lawn to 20 of its families by lottery ticket, the same way the midsummer fetes were run, so that children who had never seen the inside of a palace gate could spend an afternoon eating iced buns under a marquee and racing the royal children across the grass as though rank meant nothing at all, which for one Saturday a year on that lawn, it very nearly didn't. I had worked the little Lark's party for 6 years running by the time I am telling you about, and I want you to understand that I loved that duty more than almost any other on the calendar, because it was the one day a year I got to watch children who owed the family absolutely nothing running flat out across the grass shrieking with laughter, uncomplicated by any of the careful choreography that ordinarily surrounds a royal engagement. Crown Prince Rowan and Princess Alara were there with all 3 of their children, Torin, 11 and already, the self-appointed referee of every game invented on that lawn that afternoon. Malin, 9, deep in negotiations with 3 little Lark's girls over the rules of a hopping race that seemed to change every time someone was losing. And Prince Bram, not yet 7, who had spent the first 2 hours of the party being handed, by my count, no fewer than 4 separate slices of the same lemon cake by well-meaning nursery staff who did not realize the others had already fed him. King Alaric was away that week on a state visit to the coastal duchies, which meant the household's careful public footing rested a little more heavily than usual on Rowan's shoulders, and though nobody would have said so aloud, on Morwenna's judgment, since she was the one who had built the day from nothing and knew every family on that lawn by name. I mention this now only because it matters to everything that follows. The ordinary machinery of a royal household runs differently when its head is a continent away, and a crisis that might otherwise have been smoothed over by a king's private secretary in an afternoon instead had to be managed, piece by careful piece, by people who were still learning how much weight they could bear alone. I was posted that day on the loose perimeter walk I preferred, which let me move rather than plant myself at a single gate, tracking the whole lawn in slow, overlapping arcs, the way 16 years of training has worn into the bottom of my feet. By 3 in the afternoon, the marquee's shade had shifted enough that most of the tea tables had drifted with it. The bounce castle at the lawn's far end had deflated a little in the day's heat and been righted twice by a patient groundskeeper, and Prince Bram, who had run himself entirely out of whatever reserves a 6-year-old carries into an afternoon like that, had begun the long, unmistakable slide toward a meltdown that every parent and every guard on that lawn could see coming a good 10 minutes before it actually arrived. It started small, the way these things always do. He wanted one more turn on the bounce castle and was told, gently, that it needed to rest before the next group of children used it. He wanted the last iced bun on a nearby tray and was told, just as gently, that it belonged to a little Lark's boy who had been eyeing it for the better part of an hour. Each small refusal landed on him like a stone dropped into water that was already close to overflowing, and by the time Princess Ilara knelt down in front of him near the edge of the rose pergola and told him, in the soft, unhurried voice she used for exactly this kind of moment, that it was nearly time to say goodbye to their guests and go in for a rest, the stone that finally tipped him over arrived, and Bram began with the whole body. Unfiltered grief that only a very tired 6-year-old can produce, to cry. I want to be honest about what that crying looked like from where I stood, because it is the entire hinge of what happened next. It was loud. It was the kind of crying that turns heads across a lawn full of chattering guests, arms flailing, small fists briefly striking at nothing in particular the way an overtired child's body does when it has run out of words for what it is feeling. Ilara gathered him up against her shoulder the way she must have done 1,000 times before, murmuring something into his hair, and Bram, rather than settling, arched hard against her, one arm swinging wide, kicking at the air, the whole small furious weight of him fighting the very comfort being offered. Morwenna was perhaps 15 feet away when it began, deep in conversation with a little Lark's mother about the trust's roofing repairs, and I watched her hear the change in the crying before I would have thought it possible for anyone that far off to notice it, her head turning, her conversation abandoning itself mid-sentence, already moving before I had finished registering that she had moved at all. She crossed that 15 feet quickly, too quickly, I would think later, for a woman in a long summer dress and low heels on a lawn still damp in patches from the morning's watering, and reached Ilara and Bram at almost the same instant. Ilara's own knees had begun to buckle slightly under the writhing weight of him, both of them trying in that first confused half-second to do the same thing at once, to take hold of a thrashing, overtired child and make him feel safe. I was standing at an angle I would spend a great many hours afterward wishing I had not been standing at, behind the rose pergola's near post, with the low afternoon sun coming straight along the lawn into my eyes, and a cluster of little Lark's families between me and the 3 of them thick enough that I caught the scene only in pieces, through gaps, the way you catch a scene through a fence rather than a window. What I saw in that narrow, sun-glared, half-obstructed gap was this. Morwenna's arms coming up fast and reaching, her bracelet catching for an instant in the loose fabric of Ilara's sleeve, as both women's hands closed near Bram at almost the same moment, his small body swinging between them with the momentum of his own crying, one of Ilara's arms drawing back as Morwenna's closed around him, a visible, unmistakable tug of fabric and limbs that from 15 feet away, through a gap in a rose hedge, with the sun in my eyes, looked for exactly half a second like 2 grown women, pulling a screaming child between them. I did not think. That is the truest thing I can tell you about the next several seconds, and it is the part of this story I have had the most difficult time forgiving myself for, even now, even knowing everything I came to know afterward. 16 years of training does not ask you to think in a moment like that. It asks you to move, and I moved, 2 full strides across wet grass before any part of my mind had caught up with my legs, my hand already lifting, my voice already forming the first word of whatever I had been about to say, and it was on the 3rd stride, close enough now to see past the hedge, past the sun, past the tangle of fabric and arms that had looked so wrong from a distance, that I saw the truth of it plainly enough to stop dead where I stood. Morwenna had not pulled Bram from anyone. She had simply reached him a half step ahead of her own balance, arriving with both arms already open in the particular eager, slightly too fast way of a grandmother who cannot bear to watch a child she loves cry for 1 second longer than necessary, and in doing so had reached past Alara's supporting arm rather than around it, so that for one genuinely tangled instant both women had a hand somewhere on the same small, thrashing boy, neither of them pulling against the other. Both of them simply trying to get to him first. Bram, for his part, was not being fought over. He was being held, twice over, by two people who loved him more than either particularly cared about looking graceful while doing it, and the arm I had seen swing wide and free had been his own, still mid-tantrum, flailing at nothing. "Oh, I'm sorry, I've got him tangled up in your," Morwenna was saying, half laughing already, working her bracelet free of Alara's sleeve with her free hand while her other arm settled Bram against her shoulder, and Alara, breathless, laughing too now in the particular relieved way of a tired mother handing off a heavy, unhappy child to someone equally determined to help, said something back I did not catch over the sudden roaring in my own ears. Because I was standing 3 feet from the Queen Consort of Eldermoor with my hand half raised and no earthly idea, now, what I had imagined I was about to do with it. Bram, tucked against Morwenna's shoulder now, gave one last enormous hiccuping sob, the sound of a storm already spending the last of itself, and then, with the total and instant reversal that only very small children seem capable of, looked up, caught sight of me standing there with my arm still half lifted like a man who had forgotten what his own hand was for, and said, in a voice thick with recent tears and already sliding toward delight, "Corin, why are you doing that?" I lowered my arm. I am not sure I have ever lowered anything more slowly in my life. "I'm not entirely sure myself, Your Highness," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I meant it to, which made Bram, mercurial as only an overtired 6-year-old can be, laugh outright, a small hiccuping giggle that had nothing whatsoever to do with the crying of 90 seconds earlier. Morwenna looked at me over the top of his head, and for one long beat I braced myself the way you brace for weather, certain I was about to see something sharp cross her face. A fence, at the very least, at a guard who had come 3 strides toward her with his hand raised as though she were a stranger to be stopped rather than the woman who had built this entire afternoon out of 9 years of quiet devotion to children who were not, by any accident of blood, required to be hers to love. What I saw instead, once I let myself actually look, was something closer to startled amusement fighting its way up through the tail end of her own scattered nerves. The particular expression of a person who has just realized, a beat too late, exactly how a small, ordinary chaos must have looked from the wrong angle. "Corin Vale," she said, "were you about to rescue my grandson from me?" There is no dignified answer to that question, and I did not find one. For about half a second, Your Grace, yes, I admitted. I saw the tangle from behind the pergola with the sun in my eyes, and it looked. I stopped myself, aware of how it was going to sound spoken aloud in front of a dozen little Lark's families still watching with frank, curious interest, and finished it anyway, because I had learned a long time ago that half a truth told badly does more damage than the whole of it told plainly. It looked, for a moment, like the two of you were pulling him between you. "We very nearly were," Alara said, wiping at her own eyes with the back of one hand, still catching her breath from the small storm of the last 2 minutes. "I had him and then Morwenna had him, and I'm honestly not certain either of us let go of the other bit in time." She looked down at her sleeve, still faintly creased where the bracelet had caught it, and began, unexpectedly, to laugh properly now, the sound loosening something tight across her shoulders. "We looked like a farce. I'm only sorry there wasn't a slapstick prize on offer, because between the two of us we'd have won it outright." Morwenna, still bouncing Bram gently against her hip in the automatic, unthinking way of someone who has done it 10,000 times before, glanced down at him and found him already gazing up at her with the glazed, entirely spent look of a child 3 minutes from falling properly asleep against her shoulder. "I do apologize, Alara," she said, though the apology had gone soft and easy now, worn smooth by the plain relief of the last several seconds. I saw him going and I simply moved. I didn't stop to think whether you had him well in hand already." "You never do stop to think," Alara said, and there was nothing unkind in it at all. If anything, there was something close to fondness worn thin by long familiarity, the particular affection of a daughter-in-law who has, over the years, come to count on exactly this quality in the older woman rather than resent it. "It's rather the whole point of you, I've come to think." Bram, drowsy now, one small fist curled loosely in the fabric of Morwenna's collar, mumbled something none of us quite caught, and Morwenna bent her head to catch it properly. And whatever it was made her laugh, a real laugh this time, low and surprised out of her, before she looked back up at the small circle of us still standing in the dappled light beneath the pergola. "He says," she reported, "that he wasn't crying because he was sad. He was crying because everybody kept saying no to him at the same time, and it wasn't fair." She pressed a kiss to the top of his head, entirely unself-conscious in front of the watching families, entirely unbothered by the dozen phones I could see, now that I finally let myself look properly at the crowd around us, held up at various angles to catch the last of the small, ordinary drama that had just unfolded on the lawn. I did not think much of the phones in that moment. I want to be honest about that, because it is the part of this account where I was, in a different and quieter way, wrong a second time that afternoon. I had spent so much of my attention on the first mistake, on the 3 strides I had taken, on the half-raised hand, on the plain fact that I had, however briefly, looked at 2 women who loved a crying child more than almost anything else in the world, and mistaken their love for a struggle, that I did not stop to consider what a dozen strangers standing behind a rose hedge, with the same sun in their eyes and the same narrow, obstructed angle I had been standing at, might have seen through their own screens in that same confused half-second, or what they might do with it once they got home. "Captain will want to hear about this properly, Your Grace," I said, once Bram's fist had gone fully slack against Morwenna's collar, and his breathing had settled into the deep, even rhythm of a child finally, completely asleep. "I put my hand up toward you in front of 24 witnesses. That's not something I can simply let pass without a report." "Of course," Morwenna said, and there was nothing but plain understanding in it, no trace of the offense I had braced myself for a few minutes earlier. "Tell him exactly what you saw and exactly why you moved, Corin, and tell him it ended in nothing worse than a tangled bracelet and a very tired little boy who is, at this precise moment, entirely and completely fine." She shifted Bram's weight slightly higher against her shoulder, glancing once more at the small crowd of onlookers still lingering with their phones only half lowered. "I imagine we'll both be hearing rather more about the tangled bracelet than either of us would like before the week is out, if today is anything like the ordinary run of things. But that's a worry for tomorrow, and this lawn still has cake on it and children who haven't finished their races." She smiled, tired but genuine, and for a moment the whole small alarm of the last 5 minutes seemed to settle into exactly the shape it deserved, a very small, very ordinary thing, already passing. "I want to tell you that it stayed that size. I would give a great deal, even now, to be able to tell you that." The rest of the little lark's party ran exactly as it was meant to run, 3-legged races judged with theatrical seriousness by Torin. A final assault on what remained of the lemon cake. A slow, sun-warmed procession of goodbyes at the East Wing gates as families climbed back into the coaches that would carry them home across the river. I finished my shift the way I finished most shifts, walking the same corridor back to the guardroom I had walked 10,000 times before, and I made my report to Captain Aldous Price before I had even changed out of my dress tunic, exactly as Morwenna had told me to: the tangle, the sun, the half-raised hand, the plain and entirely undramatic truth of a tired little boy caught for one confused second between 2 people who both wanted, more than anything, to comfort him. Price was a broad, unhurried man who had come up through the regiment the slow way, post by post, rather than arriving at his captaincy through connection or luck, and he listened to the whole of it without once interrupting, the particular stillness he brought to every report that mattered, his pen resting untouched beside the logbook the entire time I spoke. "You put your hand up toward the Queen Consort," he said, when I had finished, in the flat, careful tone of a man confirming a fact rather than delivering a verdict. "In front of 24 guest families and however many phones." "Yes, sir." "And she wasn't upset with you?" "No, sir." If anything, she seemed to find it more amusing than anything else, once the boy had settled. Price studied me for a long moment, the way he studied most things, unhurried and thorough, and then made a single line of notation in the log and closed it with a soft, final sound. "Well," he said, "it's a small thing, Vale, and a well-meant one, and 9 times out of 10, a small, well-meant thing like this never leaves the lawn it happened on." He paused, and something in his face, not quite worry, but the beginning shape of it, made me understand before he said the next part, that he was thinking of something I had not yet thought of myself. "But we had 20 families on that lawn today with telephones in their pockets, and I have learned in this job that it only ever takes one of them deciding a small, well-meant thing looked, for half a second, like something worth sharing." I did not think much of that warning that evening, if I am honest. I finished my shift, ate a quiet supper in the guardroom with 2 other members of the detail, and went to bed without giving the afternoon's tangle of arms and bracelets more than a passing, faintly embarrassed thought, the kind of memory you expect to fade into a story you tell against yourself, once, at some future dinner, and never think of again. It was Price himself who found me the next morning, before I had finished my first cup of tea, holding his telephone out at the particular careful arm's length that told me, before he said a single word, exactly what kind of morning I was about to have. "Someone's put it online," he said. "A woman at the party filmed the whole thing from behind the pergola, same angle you had, more or less, same sun in her eyes by the look of the footage. 11 seconds. It starts just before her grace reaches for the boy and ends just after you've closed the distance with your hand coming up." He turned the screen toward me, and I watched it play once, then a second time, my stomach dropping further with each viewing in a way that felt uncomfortably, sickeningly familiar even though I had never lived through anything quite like it before. There was no sound worth anything on the clip beyond crowd noise and the tail end of a child's crying. There was no context, no gentle laughter afterward, no tired little boy settling instantly and completely into a grandmother's shoulder. There was only a woman's arms reaching fast toward a screaming child already held by another woman, a visible tug of fabric, and a guard closing the gap between them with his hand rising. And then the clip simply ended, exactly at the worst possible second, exactly where the truth would have begun to show itself, had the camera run 3 seconds longer. Whoever filmed it captioned it something like, "Family struggle over young prince at royal garden party. Guard steps in," Price went on, not unkindly, but with the flat weight of a man who had clearly already spent the better part of an hour finding out exactly how far the thing had traveled before he ever brought it to me. "It's been reposted past counting since last night, Vale. Somebody's already found out who was filming and is asking her for an interview." My first thought, sharp and immediate in a way that surprised me even as I felt it, was not for myself, nor even at first for Morwenna. It was for the plain, sleepy weight of Bram's fist curled loose against her collar as he finally drifted off, the sound of his own small, unbothered voice explaining, through her, exactly why he had been crying. Everybody kept saying no to him at the same time, and it wasn't fair, and I understood, standing there in the guardroom with my tea going cold in my hand, that somewhere out in the wider world an enormous number of strangers who had never stood anywhere near that rose pergola were now looking at 11 seconds of silent footage and building, in the empty space where the truth belonged, whatever story frightened them most. "Has Her Grace seen it?" I asked. "I'd imagine so by now," Price said. "I'd imagine the whole household has." He was not wrong. By the time I reported for my shift that afternoon, the corridors of Harrogate had taken on the particular strange texture I would come, over the following days, to recognize as the shape of a household absorbing a shock it had not asked for, and could not yet fully answer. Too much brisk, determined quiet in some rooms, too much low, urgent murmuring behind half-closed doors in others. Staff moving a half-step faster than usual with their eyes fixed very carefully on whatever task sat directly in front of them. I did not see Morwenna that day, nor the next. I saw Bram once briefly, being walked to his afternoon rest by a nursery maid, entirely unbothered, humming some tuneless small song to himself, and dragging a wooden horse by its string along the flagstones, and the ordinary cheerful sight of him, safe, sleepy, utterly untouched by whatever storm was gathering somewhere over his head, did more to steady me through those first uneasy hours than anything Price or anyone else could have said to me directly. Crown Prince Rowan, I learned later, had seen the clip within the hour of it beginning to spread, and had done, in that first crucial stretch of the crisis, the one thing a man managing a household in his father's absence can do that actually helps, which is nothing dramatic at all. He did not issue a statement. He did not summon the press. He sent, instead, a single quiet instruction down through the household, through Price, to me. And I understood later through similar careful channels to every other member of the guard and staff who had been anywhere near the long lawn, that no one was to speak to any journalist about what had happened, on the record or off, until the family had decided together how the matter ought to be handled. "He's not hiding anything," Price told me when I asked, worried that our silence would look to outsiders exactly like the guilt it was not. "He's trying to keep this from being told 100 different ways by 100 different people who weren't there, half of them with no idea there was ever a bracelet involved at all. There's a difference, Vale, even if it doesn't always look like one from where you're standing." I understood the sense of it. I did not find it especially comforting. Comfort, in the days that followed, was in short supply for anyone touched by that 11 seconds of footage. It was 2 days later, crossing the long East Gallery on an errand that had nothing at all to do with the family, that I finally saw Morwenna again. Not, as I had half expected, summoned to account for myself in some formal way, but simply crossing my path in the ordinary run of the palace's day, walking slowly with her hands folded in front of her in the particular manner she used when she was thinking hard about something, and did not especially want to be interrupted in the middle of it. I stepped aside, as protocol required, and expected nothing more than that. She stopped instead. "Corin." Her voice was quieter than it had been on the lawn, threaded with a tiredness that had not been there 2 days earlier, though she offered me something that was trying, gamely, to be her ordinary warmth. "I understand you've had rather a difficult 48 hours yourself." "It's nothing next to what you've had, Your Grace." She studied me for a moment with the particular careful attention that had unsettled me a little the first time I ever felt it turned my way, 4 years earlier, and had long since become something closer to comfortable familiarity. "I wanted you to hear from me directly, since I don't imagine anyone else has thought to say it plainly enough, that none of this is your doing. Not the 11 seconds someone happened to catch on a telephone, not the caption a stranger decided to put beneath it, and certainly not whatever a great many people who were never within 50 feet of that pergola have chosen to believe about a silent clip with no context at all." She paused, and something in her posture eased fractionally, tiredness winning out for just a moment over the composure she had clearly been holding together all day. "I confess I hadn't expected quite this much of it. I have had a good deal of practice, in this family, being spoken of unkindly by people who have never met me. I would have thought, after 9 years of it, I'd built up some real tolerance. I find that I have not, particularly when the unkindness concerns Bram." There was something in the way she said his name, not defensive, not performing wounded feeling for an audience of one guard in an empty gallery, but with a plain, unguarded ache, that told me more about the true weight of the last 2 days than anything else she could have said. "For what it's worth, Your Grace," I told her, "the prince himself doesn't seem troubled in the slightest. I saw him yesterday. He was dragging a wooden horse down the flagstones and humming to himself." That drew something close to a real smile out of her, brief but genuine. Children have a mercifully short memory for things that upset them for half a second and then turn out to be nothing at all, she said. It is the rest of us who seem determined to remember it forever. She was, as it would turn out, entirely correct, though neither of us yet understood how much longer forever was going to feel, nor how much worse the story would get before enough people outside that small circle of witnesses were willing to believe the plain, unglamorous truth of it. I should tell you now, because it matters to everything that follows, something of what I had come to understand about Morwenna in 9 years of watching her from a guard's careful distance, and something more that I only learned properly during the difficult stretch that followed the little lark's party, once the whole affair forced people around the palace to talk about her more openly than they usually did. She had come into this family later than most people would have preferred, if I am honest about the gossip that had followed her arrival. A widow of good but unremarkable family, meeting King Alaric some years after the death of his first wife, the late Queen Isolde, and marrying him at a point when his children were already old enough to have fixed and complicated feelings about the whole arrangement. The newspapers of that earlier decade had not been kind to her. I had been posted elsewhere in the kingdom at the time, young and largely unaware of palace politics, but I remembered enough of the general shape of it. The insinuations that she had married for the crown rather than the man, the unflattering comparisons to the wife who had come before her, the caricature of a cold, calculating stepmother that clung to her in print long after anyone who actually knew her would have told you it fit her about as well as a coat 2 sizes too small. What the newspapers of that decade had never printed, because Morwenna had never once tried to make it their business, was the slow, patient, entirely private work she had done in the years since birthdays remembered without fanfare. A nursery trust funded and visited every September without her name ever appearing on a single invitation. A decade of small kindnesses offered to children who were not, by any accident of blood, required to be hers to love. Extended not because it might improve a reputation she had long ago stopped believing anything could repair, but because she had, somewhere in all that quiet, unwitnessed work, come to genuinely love them. Bram most of all, perhaps, because Bram had never known a version of this family that did not already include her. She had been fully, unremarkably present for the whole of his short life, the way a grandmother simply is, without any of the wary adjustment the older children had needed years to work through. I understood, once I knew the fuller shape of it, exactly why an 11-second clip with no sound and no context had cut so much deeper into her than into me. My own difficulty, whatever the footage seemed to suggest about my judgment, was a professional matter, embarrassing, certainly, repairable through the ordinary channels of a captain's inquiry and a plain report. Hers was something else entirely. Hers was the reopening of an old wound she had spent nearly a decade quietly closing, torn back open in a single afternoon by a stranger's telephone, and a caption written by someone who had never stood close enough to hear a wooden horse dragged along a flagstone corridor. The gossip sheet that did the most damage called itself the Weekly Diadem, a scandal broadsheet of the kind every kingdom seems to grow like a weed regardless of how carefully its palace tries to keep the genuine press at a fair arm's length. It ran the clip across its front page on the Wednesday following the party, 4 days after the tangle beneath the pergola, under a headline I still remember with an unpleasant clarity: "A Grandmother's Grip. What was Morwenna really doing with Prince Bram?" The article beneath it was, technically, careful. It never used the word violence, never used the word abuse, hedged every sentence with words like appeared and reportedly and sources close to the event describe. But the effect of all that careful hedging was, if anything, worse than an outright accusation would have been. It let its readers fill in the ugliest version themselves, and gave the paper the thin cover of never having printed a single sentence it could be sued over. Duchess Sylvie of Rosemont arrived at Harrogate 3 days after that front page ran, having driven up from Rosemont the moment her husband, Duke Edmund, showed her the clip circulating on his own telephone, and I happened to be on duty near the East Gate when her carriage came through, moving rather faster than protocol strictly allowed. I had crossed paths with Sylvie perhaps a dozen times over the years, a warm, plain-spoken woman who had befriended Morwenna properly in the years after her marriage to Alaric, when so few others in that particular circle had bothered to, and she was not carrying much of her usual warmth with her that afternoon. "Where is she?" she said to me, not quite a question, already half out of the carriage before it had fully stopped. I told her, and watched her cross the courtyard with her jaw set in a way that made me quietly grateful I was not whoever, exactly, had written that headline, though, as it turned out, her fury that week was never aimed at any single person so much as at a world that seemed, to her endless frustration, permanently ready to believe the very worst of a woman the instant the flimsiest excuse was offered to it. I was not present for whatever conversation Sylvie and Morwenna had that evening. But 2 days after Sylvie's carriage came through the East Gate, I had a conversation of my own that I had not expected and have thought about often since, and I think it belongs here, because it taught me something about the shape of this particular scandal that Morwenna's own account, generous as it was, could not have taught me on its own. I was standing a quiet post near the nursery corridor, close to the end of an unremarkable afternoon shift, when Princess Alara found me there, not summoned, not by any formal channel, simply appearing at the end of the corridor with the particular careful, deliberate walk of a person who has decided to have a conversation and is still working up the nerve to begin it. She was not, by nature, a woman who sought out guardsmen for private conversation. In 9 years I could count on one hand the number of times she had spoken to me about anything beyond the ordinary courtesies of a shared household, and I understood, watching her approach, that whatever she had come to say had been sitting in her for some time before she finally decided to say it. "Corin, do you have a moment?" I told her, of course, that I did, and she drew a slow breath, the kind that precedes something a person has rehearsed more than once and still cannot quite make sound easy. "I keep thinking," she said, "that everyone in this household has spent a fortnight worrying about what that footage did to Morwenna's reputation, and rightly so, because it has been dreadful for her, and I have watched it be dreadful for her every single day. But I don't think anyone has stopped to ask what it might have done to mine, and I find I don't entirely know how to raise it without sounding as though I am trying to make this about myself when it so plainly isn't." She looked away from me, down the empty corridor, gathering herself. "In that footage, Corin, I am the one who appears to be losing my grip on my own son. I am the one whose arm draws back. If a stranger wanted to build the ugliest possible story out of those 11 seconds, they would not need to decide whether Morwenna was the villain of it. They could just as easily have decided it was me, an overwhelmed mother, holding on too tightly or not tightly enough, however they preferred to imagine it. I have read exactly 3 articles about this whole business, against my own better judgment, and in 2 of them there is a sentence, buried well down the page, wondering aloud whether the real story is that I was struggling to manage my own child at a public event, not Morwenna's grip, mine. I had not considered this, and told her so plainly, because I did not think a comfortable lie would have served her half as well as an honest admission of my own oversight. "I hadn't thought of it from that angle at all, Your Highness. I've been so occupied with what it did to her grace, and with what it did to my own standing, that I confess I hadn't stopped to think what it might have cost you." "That's rather the point, I think," Alara said, and there was no real bitterness in it, only a kind of tired honesty. "Nobody has, particularly. Morwenna is the more famous victim of this sort of thing, and she has earned every ounce of sympathy this household can spare her, because the people who write these stories have spent a decade deciding she is the villain before they've even finished the first sentence. But mothers get written about too, Corin, just differently, not as calculating stepmothers, but as women who cannot quite hold their own children steady, who let things get away from them, who are somehow always slightly failing even when nothing at all has actually gone wrong. I have spent 11 years being a mother in front of cameras I never asked to be filmed by, and I promise you, there is always a version of the story ready and waiting in which the fault is mine, whatever actually happened. I asked her, because it seemed the only honest question left to ask, whether she wanted the household to say something publicly on her own behalf, separate from whatever was eventually done for Morwenna. She shook her head slowly. No, that's not why I'm telling you this. I don't want a statement about my own mothering. I think that would only feed the very appetite I'm trying to describe to you. I wanted to tell someone, that's all, someone who was actually standing there and saw the whole shape of it the way I did, that it isn't only Morwenna carrying the weight of those 11 seconds, even if hers is heavier and more publicly discussed. I carry a smaller, quieter version of the same weight, and I have found, oddly, that saying it aloud to you just now has made it a good deal lighter than it was an hour ago. She managed something close to a smile. You looked stricken enough on that lawn, Corin, reaching for your own imagined mistake. I didn't think it fair that you should go on believing this whole business only ever touched Morwenna and yourself. I did not know, in that moment, how to properly thank her for trusting me with something she had plainly told almost no one else, and I have thought since that the truest thanks I could offer was simply to remember it, to understand, from that afternoon onward, that the 11 seconds of footage had drawn a wider circle of quiet damage than I had first understood, touching not only the woman the headlines had chosen as their villain, but the mother standing beside her too, in a smaller, less discussed, no less real way. I was present 4 days later for the conversation that mattered rather more to how this particular story unfolds, when Captain Price told me that the household's chief of staff, a precise, unhurried man named Perrin Locke, who had run the practical machinery of Harrogate for longer than I had held my current post, wished to speak with me directly about the incident on the lawn. It was, I understood immediately, the formal inquiry I had been quietly dreading since the moment Price first turned his telephone toward me. Locke asked me to walk him through the whole of it from the beginning, and I did, exactly as I had already told Price, exactly as I had told no one else since. He listened without interrupting, made small, precise notes in a leather folder, and when I had finished, asked me a question I had not fully prepared myself for. Guardsman Vale, in your professional judgment, not what you now know to be true, but what you believed in that instant before you moved, did you believe Her Grace intended the boy any harm? I sat with that question longer than I meant to, because the honest answer to it was more complicated than either the flattering or the damning version people outside that room seemed to want. I didn't have time to believe anything, sir, I said finally. That's the truth of it, and I know it isn't a comfortable one. I saw a shape, 2 sets of arms closing fast around a crying child, and my body moved toward the shape before my mind had formed any belief at all about the 2 women making it. If you're asking whether I thought, in that moment, that Queen Consort Morwenna was the sort of woman who would ever harm that boy, I did not think that, because I was not thinking anything. I was simply moving. Locke regarded me for a long moment, then closed his leather folder with a soft, final sound. That, he said, is either the best possible answer you could give me, or the least convenient one, depending entirely on what this household finds it needs from you in the weeks ahead. I suspect it is the best, because it also happens, so far as I can determine, to be the truth. But I want you prepared, Guardsman Vale, for the fact that the truth and the story that eventually gets told are not always the same animal, and this household has learned that lesson the hard way more than once before you and I ever had this conversation. He was, as he so often turned out to be, entirely correct, and the coming days would prove it in ways I did not yet have the imagination to anticipate. The public reaction, once the weekly diadem's front page had a full week to circulate, split roughly into three uneven camps, as these things generally do. There were those who dismissed the whole affair outright, either because they trusted the family or simply because they had no appetite for scandal dressed up as concern. There were those, a smaller and considerably louder group, who seized on the footage as confirmation of every unkind thing they had ever wanted to believe about a stepmother who had never, in a decade of public life, been extended very much benefit of the doubt at all. And there was, largest of all and most troubling to Rowan's private office, an enormous uncertain middle people who did not know quite what to think, who had seen 11 seconds of silent footage and a hedging headline and had, in the absence of anything official from the palace, simply begun to build their own private version of events. Very few of which happened to involve a tired 6-year-old, a rose pergola, and a caught bracelet. It was that uncertain middle that worried Rowan most, or so I was told by those posted closer to him than I was ever privileged to be. A scandal believed only by people already inclined to think the worst could be weathered easily enough. A scandal that curdled slowly into settled public doubt, unspoken but widespread, was a far more dangerous and durable thing, and it was that particular danger, more than any single article, that finally pushed the household toward the decision that would define the rest of this story. Though not before matters grew a good deal more difficult, and I found myself, quite without having sought it, standing closer to the center of that decision than any household guard has much right to expect. Rowan's private office, I learned later, had drafted a short statement within 2 days of the clip's first appearance. A plain, factual account confirming that the moment had involved nothing more than an overtired child, a well-meant tangle of arms, and a guard's understandable half-second of caution, with everyone involved unharmed, and within minutes, laughing about it. It sat, unreleased, on a desk for the better part of a week, and the reason for that delay taught me something about the machinery of a royal household I had never before had cause to learn in 9 years standing near its edges. You cannot simply say a thing and expect the saying of it to undo what a silent clip has already done, Price told me one evening, over the kind of long, tired conversation that only happens between men who have spent a difficult stretch worrying about the same problem from different angles. We were in the guardroom, well past the end of my shift, and he had the particular loose-tongued candor of a man who trusted the person across the table from him. Rowan's office has seen this shape of thing before, Vale, not this exact version of it, but the pattern. Release a denial too quickly, and it looks defensive, as though you're managing a crisis rather than simply telling the truth. Half the uncertain middle decides the speed itself is suspicious. Release it too slowly, and the silence starts to look like guilt to the other half. There is no clean door out of a room like this one. There is only the least bad door, and finding it always takes longer than anyone standing outside the room has the patience for. I asked him, because I had been turning the question over for days and could no longer keep it to myself, whether there was any possibility of my simply telling my own account publicly, sitting for an interview, explaining in plain words exactly what I had seen and exactly how quickly it had resolved into nothing. Price's face, when I suggested it, went carefully neutral in the particular way that meant he was about to tell me something I did not want to hear. "You're a serving member of the household guard," he said. "You don't get to become a witness for hire in your own scandal, however good your intentions. If you go to the press independently, even to help her, even to tell nothing but the plain truth, you've broken the very discretion this family depends on every one of us to keep. And the moment one guard decides his own judgment about when to speak outweighs the household's, you've made every future guard's silence worth a good deal less, because the family can no longer be entirely certain any of us will keep it when it matters most." I did trust him, though the days that followed tested exactly how much. I was not reassigned, As it happened, the way I half expected to be, Price judged, and Locke agreed, that pulling me visibly off the family detail would only feed the very story we were trying to starve. But I found myself, in the long hours of an unremarkable posting near the East Gate, replaying the whole tangle so many times that the half-second itself began to lose its edges, blurring into something I could no longer entirely trust my own memory of. Had I truly seen only a shape, arms closing fast around a crying child? Or had some part of me, some buried and uncharitable corner I did not want to believe I possessed, seen more than that, and reached for the innocent explanation afterward simply because it was easier to live inside? I want to be honest with you now, telling this from a safe distance of years, that I did not always believe my own innocence in those days. Doubt is a patient, corrosive thing, and it does not need very much room at all to work. I should say something here about Torin, too, because his own response to those difficult days was so different from his younger brother's that it has stayed with me nearly as clearly, and it taught me something rather less comforting than anything Bram eventually did. Torin was 11, old enough by then to read a headline properly, and old enough, worse, to understand what other children at his own age might make of one. I encountered him on the third or fourth day after the Diadem's first front page, in a corridor near the schoolroom, and where Bram had simply been himself, cheerfully unbothered. Torin was rigid with a kind of controlled fury I had rarely seen in him before, his jaw set, his shoulders drawn up around his ears, a boy trying very hard to hold himself the way he imagined a future king ought to hold himself, and not entirely managing it. "Somebody at my lesson said grandmother more when a hurt Bram," he said to me, without any greeting at all, the words coming out clipped and furious. I told him he was an idiot and that he didn't even watch the whole thing properly. He just saw the headline his father showed him. But then I thought about it, and I haven't watched the whole thing properly either, because Mama and Papa won't let any of us watch it, and I don't know what actually happened, not really, not the way you do, because you were standing right there. He looked at me with an intensity that made me feel, for a moment, considerably smaller than my 16 years of service usually allowed me to feel. "Did she hurt him, Corin? You have to tell me the truth." Everyone keeps saying it's nothing, but grown-ups say that about all sorts of things that turn out not to be nothing. I understood, standing in that corridor, that I was being asked a question with rather more weight behind it than its words alone carried. Not simply whether Bram had been hurt, which I could answer honestly and immediately, but whether the adults around Torin could be trusted to tell him the truth even when the truth was difficult. A question that mattered a great deal to a boy on the edge of growing into responsibilities he had not chosen and could not yet fully see the shape of. "No," I told him, as plainly and as steadily as I could manage. "She did not hurt him, Torin, not for one single second, not even by accident." I was standing close enough to see it happen and close enough to be wrong about it myself for half a second, which is the only part of that afternoon I have any real reason to be sorry for. Your brother was crying because he was tired and cross, and your mother and your grandmother both wanted to comfort him at the same moment, and got a little tangled doing it. And within a minute, he was fast asleep against Morwenna's shoulder without a mark on him anywhere. I give you my word on that, and I would not give it to you lightly. Something in Torin's rigid shoulders eased, though not entirely, not yet. Then why won't anyone just say that, loudly? To everyone. Because saying a true thing loudly and quickly doesn't always make people believe it, I said, particularly when a false thing has already had a head start. Your father and Master Locke are trying to do it properly, so that it actually settles the matter instead of simply adding one more loud voice to a very loud argument. I know that's a difficult thing to wait for, especially when someone at your own lessons says something unkind and untrue about your family to your face. Torin considered this with the same serious, faintly suspicious weighing of an answer that I would later recognize, watching Bram do something similar over his wooden horse, as a trait that seemed to run through every child in that family regardless of age. "I still think he's an idiot," he said finally, some of his fury softening now into something closer to plain 12-year-old stubbornness. "But I believe you. You wouldn't lie to me about Bram. You like him too much to lie about him." I told him that was as true a thing as he had said all week, and he managed, briefly, something like a smile before straightening his shoulders again and walking on toward his lessons with rather more composure than he had arrived with. I mentioned Torrens' fury alongside Bram's untroubled calm, because I think together they showed me the whole real cost of those 2 weeks more honestly than any single account could have on its own. A household in which one child could sleep through the entire scandal without a single bad dream, and another lay awake, in his own quieter way, wondering whether the people who loved him would tell him the truth even when it was hard to hear. Both of them, in the end, were answered honestly. It mattered enormously. I came to believe that they were. It was Bram, in the end, who did more to steady me than any of the adults around me managed to, though he never once knew he was doing it, and I would not have wished the responsibility onto a 6-year-old boy, even if he had offered to carry it himself. I saw him perhaps a week after the party, in the palace's private schoolroom courtyard, where he had been let out for a break between his morning lessons, and was engaged in the serious business of walking his wooden horse along the top of the low garden wall, one careful hoof at a time. I was passing through on an errand that had nothing to do with him at all, and he spotted me before I had decided whether it was proper to interrupt him. "Corin," he waved with his whole arm, nearly toppling the horse off the wall in the process, and caught it just in time with the fierce concentration of a boy who has clearly had practice recovering from his own enthusiasm. "Do you want to see Marigold jump the wall? She can do it now. She couldn't before, but now she can." I told him I would be honored to see it, and stood at a respectful distance while he demonstrated, with considerable narration, exactly how far Marigold the wooden horse could now jump. Partway through her third attempt, he paused, horse still clutched in one fist, and looked up at me with the sudden, unguarded directness children bring to subjects the adults around them have spent a week tiptoeing carefully past. "Everyone's being funny about the crying thing," he said. Not a question, a plain statement of observed fact, delivered with the mild, faintly put-upon irritation of a boy who finds the behavior of grown-ups generally baffling, and this instance no exception. Malin said some people think Morwenna and Mama were fighting over me. That's silly. They both wanted to hold me at the same time because I was crying and nobody could decide who got to first. He resumed Marigold's assault on the garden wall, entirely unbothered, as though he had just settled a minor dispute about the rules of a game rather than corrected the record on the most damaging rumor to touch his family in years. I liked it, actually. It's funny when two grown-ups both try to pick you up at once. You go a bit sideways. I did not know quite what to say to him, and settled in the end for something true and simple. Sometimes, I told him, when grown-ups don't see the whole of something, they fill in the missing part with whatever frightens them most, instead of waiting to find out what actually happened. Bram considered this with the same serious attention he had given Marigold's jump. "That seems like a bad way to figure things out," he said finally, with the flat, devastating clarity that only children and the very old ever seem able to summon, and went back to his horse, leaving me standing in that courtyard with the strange, humbling sense of having just been taught something important by a boy not yet 7. I wish I could tell you that Bram's plain good sense settled the matter on its own. That word of a child's own unbothered account spread through the palace and out into the wider kingdom, and simply dissolved the whole ugly business within the week. It did not, and I have thought a great deal since about why the simplest and truest version of a story so often struggles to travel as fast as the most damaging one. The weekly diadem ran a second piece 9 days after the first, this one noting, with the same careful hedging, that the young prince had been overheard by a palace source, describing the incident as nothing more than an overeager grandmother, and then spent 3 full paragraphs speculating on whether a boy that young could reliably be trusted to understand what he had experienced, or whether he might simply be repeating whatever explanation the adults around him had supplied. It was a uniquely ugly piece of writing, dressed up as caution, and it did more damage in some ways than the first headline had, because it took the one clean, simple truth available to everyone and made even that sound suspect. It was around this time that I finally understood the household needed to stop merely enduring the story and start actively pursuing the truth of it. And it was, in a strange and roundabout way, Duchess Sylvie who first said so plainly, in a conversation I happened to overhear the tail end of while standing post outside a small sitting room off the East Gallery. "You cannot outwait a story like this one," I heard her say, her voice carrying with the particular clipped urgency of a woman who had run out of patience with careful, incremental strategy. "Silence bought you time in the first week, Rowan, and I understand why your father's office favored it. But time is not the same thing as truth, and this uncertain middle everyone keeps worrying over isn't going to sit patiently in the dark, forever waiting for you to decide it's safe to speak. Somebody needs to go and find out exactly what that woman with the telephone actually captured, the whole of it, not just the 11 seconds someone chose to share, and somebody needs to do it now, before the diadem finds her first and decides for her what the rest of her footage means." I did not hear Rowan's reply clearly enough to repeat it, but I understood within the hour, from the sudden shift in the household's quiet, careful pace, that the conversation had landed. Locke summoned Price that same afternoon, and Price, in turn, summoned me, not this time, to answer for what I had done on the lawn, but because I was, as it happened, the one member of the detail who had actually stood near enough to the small crowd of onlookers that afternoon to remember faces. "There was a woman near the pergola," Price said, laying a printed still from the 11-second clip on the table between us, a blurred, sideways frame that had clearly been taken from the very footage now circulating everywhere. Fair hair, blue cardigan, holding her telephone up rather higher than most of the others around her. "Locke wants to know if you remember her." I studied the still for a long moment, letting my memory do the slow, careful work it had been trained to do, sorting back through the ordinary texture of that afternoon. The tea tables, the bounce castle, the particular pattern of families I had walked past a dozen times on my loose perimeter arcs. And I did remember her, once I let myself look properly. A little lark's mother I had exchanged perhaps 3 words with near the lemonade table an hour before the tangle, laughing at something her own small daughter had said, entirely unremarkable in every way except that she had, as it turned out, been standing at almost the exact same angle I had, with almost the exact same sun in her eyes. "Priya Aslund," I said, the name arriving with a small, surprising jolt of certainty. "Her daughter's called Wren, I think. Little larks, one of the newer families I remember because she asked me where the toilets were and thanked me very properly for showing her, which not everyone bothers to do." Locke had her found within a day, through the nursery trust's own careful records, and the conversation that followed, conducted, I was told, with enormous tact by a member of Rowan's private office, rather than by anyone who might have frightened her, revealed something that gave the whole household its first real flicker of hope in nearly 2 weeks. Priya Aslund had not, in fact, stopped filming after the 11 seconds someone else had lifted and shared. She had kept her telephone raised for nearly a full minute afterward, capturing, she said, the sweet bit at the end, when the little boy went to sleep on the queen consort's shoulder, because I thought it was lovely and wanted to remember it, entirely unaware that a stranger elsewhere on that lawn had already clipped and shared only the ugliest 11 seconds of what she had recorded. She agreed, once it was gently explained to her exactly what damage those 11 seconds had done, to hand over the whole of her footage, nearly 50 seconds in total, more than 4 times the length of what had already spread across half the kingdom. And for one bright, giddy afternoon, it seemed to everyone involved that the matter might simply be over, that a frightened, overtired boy's whole small drama and its whole gentle resolution would finally be visible to anyone who cared to look. It was not quite so simple as that. And the reason it was not taught me something further about how rarely good fortune arrives in a single unbroken piece. Priya Aslan's fuller footage was, in almost every respect, exactly the gift the household had hoped for. It showed Bram's tantrum building from a full 20 seconds earlier than the leaked clip began, his small fist striking at nothing, his voice climbing toward the particular ragged pitch that only genuine overtiredness produces. It showed Alara kneeling to gather him up, and Morwenna crossing the 15 feet between them with exactly the eager, slightly too fast urgency I remembered from my own vantage that afternoon. And it showed plainly in the seconds immediately following the leaked clip's abrupt cut, Bram's last enormous hiccuping sob giving way to sudden, total stillness against Morwenna's shoulder, his fist curling into her collar, his whole small body going slack with the particular boneless trust of a child who has decided all at once that he is finally, entirely safe. It showed Alara laughing. It showed my own hand lowering. It showed, in short, nearly everything. What it did not show, clearly, was the 4 or 5 seconds in the exact middle of the tangle, the seconds that mattered most, the ones the whole ugly headline had been built on, because Priya Aslan, in the ordinary and entirely forgivable way of someone filming with a telephone rather than a professional camera, had shifted her grip at precisely the wrong instant, her thumb drifting across the very edge of the lens for just long enough to soften those crucial frames into a blurred, half-obscured smear of fabric and motion that could, if a viewer was determined enough to read it that way, still be made to look like almost anything at all. Locke's office reviewed the full 50 seconds 3 times before anyone was willing to say aloud what everyone in that small room had already privately concluded. It helps enormously, Locke told Price, in a conversation Price later relayed to me nearly word for word, sensing correctly that I needed to hear it plainly rather than softened. It shows the whole shape of the afternoon in a way the leaked clip never did, and any fair-minded person watching the full 50 seconds is going to walk away believing exactly what actually happened. But we do not currently possess a single unbroken frame that shows, beyond any argument at all, precisely what those 2 hands were doing in the middle of that tangle. And I promise you, Vale, there are people out there who will notice that gap, and who will decide, entirely wrongly but entirely predictably, that the household is choosing not to show it because it doesn't say what we claim it says. He was, as he so often was, entirely correct, and the weekly diadem found the gap within 4 days of the fuller footage beginning, cautiously, to circulate through friendlier channels. Why won't the palace show us the missing seconds? Ran the paper's 3rd front page on the matter, and this time the hedging had thinned almost to nothing at all, the article beneath it noting, with an air of wounded public-spiritedness that made my jaw ache from clenching it, that a family so quick to release nearly a minute of flattering footage has offered no explanation for the several seconds it has conspicuously chosen to leave blurred, as though Priya Aslan's thumb had been some deliberate act of household concealment rather than the plain, unglamorous accident of an ordinary woman filming an ordinary afternoon on an ordinary telephone. I remember exactly where I was standing when Price showed me that 3rd headline at the West Gate, in the thin gray light of an early autumn morning, my breath fogging faintly in the cold, and I remember, more than anything else about that moment, the particular sinking recognition that we had done everything we were supposed to do, had found the honest witness and gathered the honest footage and told the honest account of it, and that none of it, in the end, had been quite enough. It was in the days immediately following that 3rd headline that I came closest, in the whole of this affair, to genuinely doubting whether I still belonged in this uniform at all. The doubt did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way water finds a crack slowly, through a dozen small moments that on their own meant almost nothing and together meant a great deal. It arrived when a junior guardsman I did not know well, newly posted to an outer gate, asked me, half joking and clearly unaware of quite how the joke would land, whether I was, the one who tried to wrestle the queen consort, and I found I could not answer him with anything lighter than silence. It arrived when I caught myself, on an ordinary Tuesday, standing near enough to watch Alara carry a sleepy Tauren in from the garden and feeling, for one genuinely unsettling instant, a flicker of the same old useless instinct, the shape, the reaching arms, the readiness to move, before I forced it back down with an effort that left my hands faintly unsteady for the better part of an hour afterward. And it arrived, most of all, in the quiet hour I spent one evening composing, and then deleting, and then composing again, a letter to Captain Price requesting reassignment away from close family detail altogether, on the grounds that a guardsman whose own instincts could not reliably be trusted around the people he was meant to protect had no business standing anywhere near them. I did not send that letter. I want to explain why, because it matters to everything that came after. I was sitting in the guardroom past midnight, the unsent letter open in front of me, when Morwenna herself found me there. She had come down, she told me afterward, simply to fetch a shawl she had left in a nearby sitting room earlier that day, and had seen the light still burning and my own tired face through the half-open door, and had stopped rather than walked past, the way she so often did. She read the letter over my shoulder before I could think to close it, which I would ordinarily have found mortifying, and which in that particular moment I found, strangely, almost a relief. "You are not going to send this," she said. "It was not quite a question." "Your Grace, I very nearly did an hour ago." "But you have not." She pulled out the chair across from me and sat, folding her hands on the table between us in the same careful, deliberate way I had watched her fold them 100 times before in 100 more formal conversations. "Tell me why." I did not have a tidy answer for her and told her so. "I keep thinking about the boy," I said finally. "About Marigold jumping the garden wall. About the way he explained the whole thing to me himself, better than any of us have managed to explain it to the rest of the kingdom, and how simple it was for him, and how none of this, the letters, the headlines, the missing seconds everyone's decided to be so suspicious of, none of it has ever once touched him. And I keep thinking that if I walk away from this post now, out of my own doubt about my own hands, I am choosing to believe the very story I know to be false. I would be agreeing in the quietest possible way that there was something to doubt in the first place." Morwenna was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an expression I found difficult to read in the low guardroom light. "Corin," she said finally, "may I tell you something I have not said to anyone else in this household, not even Sylvie, not even my own son?" I told her, of course, that she could. "I have spent 9 days now watching my family agonize over 4 blurred seconds of a stranger's telephone footage, and do you know what I keep thinking underneath all of it? I keep thinking that the reason those 4 seconds frighten everyone so badly is that they know, deep down, exactly how thin the membrane is between how a moment of pure love actually looks, and how a moment of real harm might look, from the wrong angle in bad light, to someone standing too far away to see properly. That membrane terrifies people, Corin, because it means no one, not me, not Alara, not you, can ever fully control how a single ordinary gesture will be read by a stranger who wasn't there. And I think that terror is exactly why you cannot resign your post over it. Because if a man who reacts, badly and briefly, to that same thin membrane, and then corrects himself within 3 strides once he actually sees clearly, if that man decides he cannot be trusted, then what hope is there for the rest of us, who only ever get to see any of it from one single, fallible angle to begin with? I did not answer her properly that night. I am not certain, even now, that there was a proper answer to give. But I did not send the letter, and I did not ask again for reassignment, and something in the quiet, steady way she said all of it settled a part of me that had been unsteady for the better part of 2 weeks. The breakthrough, when it finally came, arrived from a direction none of us had thought to look in, and it arrived, appropriately enough, because of a piece of ordinary palace machinery that had nothing whatsoever to do with cameras held by nursery mothers or stringers chasing a headline. It was Guardsman Petra Voss, no relation to me despite the similar sound of our names, a sharp, methodical young woman 2 years into the detail who had a gift for noticing exactly the sort of ordinary thing everyone else had stopped noticing simply because it had always been there, who raised her hand during a routine briefing 4 days after the third headline and asked a question that made the whole small room go very quiet. "Doesn't the marquee post have a security camera on it?" she said. "For the perimeter sweep. It's been mounted there for every outdoor event for as long as I've worked this posting. Wouldn't it have been running the whole afternoon, regardless of where any of the guest families happen to be standing with their telephones?" I have turned that question over many times since, marveling at how simply, how completely it had been sitting in plain sight the entire time, overlooked by every one of us precisely, because none of us had thought to look for a witness that was not a person at all. The palace's outdoor security cameras exist for exactly one purpose: a continuous, unglamorous, wide-angle sweep of any ground the family occupies during a public or semi-public engagement, recorded not for posterity or publicity, but purely so that, in the event of a genuine security concern, someone could review exactly what had happened along any given stretch of lawn or gallery. Nobody had thought of it as a source of evidence for a family scandal, because it had never once, in the whole history of the household's careful protocols, been used for any purpose but security, and using it now, for something so far removed from its intended function, raised a set of questions Locke's office spent the better part of a day working through before anyone was willing to act on Voss's suggestion. "It is not strictly footage we release," Locke told the small group gathered in his office once Price had brought the idea to him. "Rowan present this time, along with Locke's own deputy and, at Rowan's specific request, myself, standing rather more prominently in that room than I had ever expected a guardsman of my rank to stand. Security footage exists to protect this family's safety, not to manage their public image, and there is a real question here about the precedent we set if we begin treating one as the other." He paused, weighing something visibly behind his careful eyes. "But I have watched, over these last 2 weeks, what the absence of clear evidence has cost this family, and cost Guardsman Vale personally, and I am no longer entirely persuaded that the distinction holds up as cleanly as it once did. A camera mounted specifically to protect this family from harm captured, as it happens, definitive proof that no harm ever occurred. I find I cannot argue myself into believing that using it for exactly that purpose is somehow a betrayal of what it was built for." Rowan, who had said very little through the whole of that discussion, finally spoke. "Pull it," he said. "The whole afternoon, start to finish. And let's see, once and for all, exactly what that camera was pointed at during those 4 seconds everyone keeps deciding to be so suspicious of." It took a day and a half for the palace's security office to locate and extract the relevant footage from an archive built for retrieval rather than speed, and I spent that day and a half back at my ordinary post trying, without a great deal of success, not to let myself hope too hard for a particular outcome. Hope, I had learned over the preceding fortnight, is a fragile thing to carry through a long shift, and I did not entirely trust myself to carry it well a second time. What the security office finally produced, played once for a small, silent group gathered in a windowless review room on the palace's ground floor, was, by every account I would later hear from those who watched it with me, and by my own plain memory of watching it myself, exactly as complete and exactly as unanswerable as anyone could have hoped. The camera, mounted high on the marquee's near post specifically to give the widest possible view of the long lawn, had captured the entire tangle in clean, continuous, unbroken clarity, with none of Priya Aslan's forgivable thumb anywhere near its lens. It showed Bram's tantrum building. It showed Alara kneeling. It showed Morwenna crossing the grass with her arms already opening, a half step ahead of her own balance, exactly as I remembered it. And in the 4 seconds that had cost the household 2 full weeks of agony, it showed, with total and undeniable clarity, 2 women's hands closing around the same small, thrashing boy from 2 different directions, a bracelet catching briefly in a sleeve, neither woman pulling against the other for one single frame of that footage. Both of them simply trying, with the plain, uncomplicated urgency of people who loved him, to reach him first. There is no honest way to look at those 4 seconds, Price told me afterward in the guardroom, with the particular flat certainty of a man who had watched something that had genuinely settled a question rather than merely confirmed what he had already believed, and come away thinking anything except exactly what happened. It's the whole shape of it, veil, clean and unbroken, at a resolution good enough to see the boy's face the entire time. There is no more honest doubt to be had here. There never really was, but now there is proof of that fact instead of merely faith in it. I want to tell you that the household released that footage to the public within the hour, that the truth, once it existed in a form no one could reasonably argue with, simply swept the previous fortnight's damage away like a tide going out. It did not happen quite that quickly, and the reason it did not taught me something further about how carefully a family in the public eye must move even when they hold, at last, an unimpeachable hand. We released this badly, Locke told the small group gathered around the review room's table, and we hand the weekly Diadem and everyone like it a second story instead of ending the first one, a story about a palace that sat on proof for 2 weeks while a rumor did its damage, and only produced it once it became convenient. We have one real chance to do this correctly. Let's not waste it by rushing. And so, for 3 more days, the security footage sat in a locked archive while a plan was built carefully around it. A plan that would, when it finally unfolded, do a great deal more than simply correct a rumor, and would give me, quite unexpectedly, a part to play in its final act that I had not asked for and did not feel remotely prepared to perform. The plan, as it was eventually explained to me, was built around a second visit to Little Lark's, not the annual garden party itself, which would not come around again for the better part of a year, but a smaller, quieter engagement Morwenna had already had standing in her calendar for months, a modest afternoon opening a new reading room the trust had built with funds she had, characteristically, arranged to give without her name attached to a single brick of it. Rowan's office rescheduled nothing and canceled nothing. They simply built the day, once it arrived, into the deliberate centerpiece of the household's response. Morwenna would attend exactly as planned, with Bram at her side by his own eager request, once it was gently explained to him that he would get to see Wren again and ride in a car with his grandmother, and the palace's official statement, together with 3 still frames from the security footage, chosen with obvious care to tell the story cleanly without turning the whole sequence into a spectacle, would be released to every accredited outlet that same morning. Time to reach the press well before the 2 of them ever arrived at the reading room's doors. "You'll be part of the detail that day," Price told me, 3 days before the visit, in a tone that made it plain this was not a suggestion I was being asked to weigh. Her Grace requested it specifically. "I want to be straight with you about that veil because I know your first instinct is going to be to wonder whether it's wise, given everything. It was her idea, not mine, and not Locke's office either, though they approved it readily enough once she raised it. I did wonder whether it was wise. I wondered it rather a lot, in fact, across those 3 days, turning the prospect over during long stretches of quiet duty, and finding no version of it that did not make my chest go tight with something between gratitude and dread. To stand once more within arm's reach of Morwenna and Bram, in front of the very press that had spent 2 weeks picking apart the worst 4 seconds of my career, felt less like an honor than a second trial, however kindly it had been offered to me. I said as much to Morwenna herself, the evening before the visit, when she sent word through Price that she wished to speak with me privately before the day arrived. We met in a small sitting room off the East Gallery, just the two of us, and, for the first several minutes, an increasingly restless Bram, who had apparently insisted on being present for at least part of the conversation, and was eventually persuaded, with the promise of a proper look at the reading room's new picture books the following morning, to go and find Marigold and let the two adults finish talking in peace. "I want to explain why I asked for you," Morwenna said, once the door had closed behind him. She looked, I thought, less tired than she had in the guardroom 2 weeks earlier. Some of the color and steadiness returned to her face now that the worst of the uncertainty had finally lifted. "You have spent 2 weeks, I understand, questioned by Perrin Locke, doubted more than once by your own sergeant's honest concern for you, and doubted, I would imagine, more than once by yourself, for having done exactly the thing every person in this household should pray their guards will do without hesitation if a moment ever truly comes that calls for it. I do not intend to let that be the only story anyone remembers about what happened on that lawn. Your Grace, you owe me nothing on that account. If anything, I am not finished." It was said gently but firmly, and I closed my mouth and let her continue. "I have spent nearly a decade in this family being written about by people who never once stood close enough to see the truth of anything, and I have learned mostly to let it pass over me, because fighting every unkind sentence a stranger writes is no way to live a life. But this was different, and I think you understand exactly why, because you have been living inside your own version of the same thing since the moment that clip first appeared. It was not simply that someone accused me of something monstrous. It was that they took the single instinct I trust most in myself, my hands reaching toward that boy without a half-second's hesitation, the instant I heard him crying, and tried to convince half the kingdom that the instinct meant the opposite of what it has always meant, every single day, for nearly 9 years. I will not have the same thing happen to yours. Your instinct that afternoon was not wrong, Corin. It was simply aimed, for one confused half-second, at the wrong shape through a hedge with the sun in your eyes. That is a very different thing from being wrong, and I intend for every person watching tomorrow to understand the difference, with you standing there to prove it rather than hiding at some outer gate as though you have something to be ashamed of." I did not trust myself to answer her properly in that moment, and so I said only that I would be honored to stand wherever the household needed me, which was true, and rather smaller than what I actually felt. The morning of the visit came bright and cool, the first properly autumn morning of the year, as though the season itself had decided to lower the temperature on the whole affair at last. I reported to the motor court at 8 and found the household's press office already a hive of quiet, controlled activity. The statement had gone out at 7, along with the 3 chosen stills from the security footage, and by the time our small convoy reached the little Lark's reading room a little after 9, I understood from the size of the press pool, gathered respectfully behind the barriers outside, larger than any nursery trust engagement I had ever escorted a member of the family to, before or since, that the morning's release had already done exactly what it was designed to do. The visit itself unfolded much as these visits always do, at least for the first 20 minutes, Morwenna moving through the new reading room with the unhurried warmth I had watched her bring to a dozen quieter occasions over the years, admiring a mural the children had painted along one wall, letting a boy of about 8 show her, in exhaustive detail, exactly how the new shelving worked. Bram walked beside her the whole time, uncharacteristically solemn for the cameras at first, then gradually, unable to help himself, chattering with Ren Oslund about a book they had apparently both already claimed as their favorite, until the two of them were arguing cheerfully over who had seen it first. It was outside, on the reading room's front steps, as the visit drew to its close, that the moment the whole plan had been quietly built toward finally arrived. Not stage-managed, though it had certainly been anticipated and prepared for, but genuine in the particular way that only a small child can keep a carefully arranged royal engagement genuine, right up to the very last minute of it. A reporter near the front of the press pool granted the single question the household's office had agreed in advance to allow, addressed it not to Morwenna but, with evident and slightly nervous care, to the young prince himself. "Prince Bram, would you be willing to tell us, in your own words, what happened at the garden party?" I watched Morwenna's hand find Bram's shoulder, not to silence him, I understood immediately, but simply to let him know he was free to answer or not exactly as he chose. Bram considered the question with the same serious attention he had once given Marigold's leap over the garden wall, glanced up at his grandmother for the briefest confirming instant, and then turned back to the waiting cameras with the plain, unbothered directness that had steadied me once already in a schoolroom courtyard weeks earlier. "I was crying because everybody kept saying no to me at the same time," he said, "and Mama picked me up, and then Morwenna wanted to pick me up too because she heard me crying, and we all got a bit tangled because they both wanted to hold me and neither of them wanted to let go first." He paused, apparently satisfied that this covered the essential facts, then added, with the air of someone tidying up a loose thread, "It was actually pretty funny, and I stopped crying really fast because it's hard to keep crying when two grown-ups are trying to hug you at the same time. And Corin thought something bad was happening, so he came over really fast, but it wasn't anything bad. It was just a hug that went a bit sideways." There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a press pool in the instant after a child has said something so plainly, disarmingly true, that it leaves the assembled adults with nothing clever left to ask. And I heard that silence settle over the reading room steps for a long, suspended moment before the first ripple of soft, relieved laughter broke through it, spreading outward through the crowd the way real laughter does, unforced and entirely genuine. Somewhere near the back, I heard a reporter say, not quite under her breath, "A hug that went a bit sideways, well, that's rather better than anything we've printed." And I understood, standing there in my dress uniform with my heart doing something complicated in my chest, that she was right. Morwenna crouched beside Bram, ostensibly to straighten the collar of his coat against the cool morning air, though I suspected the gesture was really about needing, for a moment, to put her face closer to his than to the cameras. "Thank you," she murmured, low enough that I only caught it because I was standing close, "for explaining it so much better than any of the rest of us managed to in 2 whole weeks." Bram, entirely unaware of having accomplished anything remarkable, only shrugged. "It was easy, I was just telling what happened." By the time our convoy returned to Harrogate that afternoon, the footage of those 30 seconds on the reading room steps had already begun the same swift, unstoppable journey through the world that the original 11-second clip had made 2 weeks earlier, except this time carrying an entirely different cargo. I watched it happen the way I imagined sailors watch a change in the wind, from the inside of a story I had lived through but no longer fully controlled, as the plain, artless honesty of a 6-year-old boy explaining a hug that went sideways did more in 30 seconds to settle a fortnight of doubt than any statement the household's careful office could have drafted in a month of trying. The Weekly Diadem, to its very limited credit, did eventually run a correction, 3 days later, tucked well back from its front page in the modest, grudging manner of a publication that has been caught out, and would prefer the fact to attract as little further attention as possible. It did not apologize, precisely. Papers of that kind rarely do, in my experience, having built their whole trade on the careful art of never quite saying anything they can be made to formally retract. But it acknowledged, in 3 flat paragraphs, that newly available security footage, together with an account from the young prince himself, confirms the incident involved an overeager display of familial affection, and not, as earlier reporting speculated, any intent of harm. It was a thin, grudging thing, but it was there in black and white, in the same publication that had done the damage, and Price told me, with some satisfaction, that Locke's office had personally seen to it that a copy was filed away in the household's records. In case anyone ever needs reminding of exactly how little those 3 paragraphs cost them to write, set against a fortnight of what they cost everyone else. I went to see Priya Asland myself, 2 days after the correction ran, on an afternoon off-duty that I spent rather more of than I strictly needed to standing on a modest doorstep in the Little Larks district, working up the nerve to knock. I had asked Price whether it was appropriate for a serving guardsman to visit a private citizen in that way, and he had considered it for a moment before telling me that he thought it was exactly the kind of appropriate that no protocol manual had ever quite found the words for, and that I should go anyway. She opened the door with Wren balanced on one hip and an expression of frank astonishment that took a moment to resolve itself into recognition. "You're the guard from the party," she said. "The one who—" She stopped herself, visibly embarrassed, and I saved her the trouble of finishing the sentence. "The one who came over rather too fast, yes. I wanted to thank you properly, Mrs. Asland, for handing over your footage when you didn't have to, and for being patient with a household that took rather longer than it should have to make proper use of it." She waved this away with the hand not occupied by her daughter, ushering me in out of the autumn chill with the same brisk, unbothered hospitality I remembered from the lemonade table. "I felt dreadful about the whole thing," she said, once we were settled in a small, cluttered front room with Wren investigating my boots with great seriousness. "I only ever meant to keep the sweet bit at the end for myself. You understand, I wasn't the one who cut it down to 11 seconds and put that awful caption on it. I've never even found out who did that part, and I'm not sure I want to. But I kept thinking, all these weeks, that if I hadn't been standing there with my telephone up in the first place, none of it would have happened at all, and that felt like rather a heavy thing to carry over an afternoon I only meant to remember fondly. I told her, as honestly as I knew how, that the fault had never once belonged to her, that a woman recording a lovely moment to keep for herself bore no more responsibility for what a stranger later did with it than a photographer bears responsibility for a picture frame someone else chooses to steal. "If anything," I said, "your footage is the reason the truth eventually came out as cleanly as it did. Without those 50 seconds, we might never have thought to go looking for the security camera at all." Something in her face eased at that, the particular relief of a person who has been quietly carrying a guilt she was never actually required to carry. "Wren still talks about it, you know," she said, glancing down at her daughter, who had by now abandoned my boots in favor of examining the buttons on my coat with the same fierce concentration Bram brought to Marigold's jumps. "She and Bram have decided they're going to be friends forever because they were both there for the tangle, as she calls it. I don't think either of them has the faintest idea what any of the grown-up fuss was actually about, which I confess I find rather a relief." I left that small front room a good deal lighter than I had arrived, and I have thought since that closing that particular loop, thanking the ordinary, unremarkable woman whose ordinary, unremarkable kindness had done more to help the truth along than any formal channel had managed on its own, mattered to me nearly as much as anything that happened in the more official rooms of the palace during those 2 difficult weeks. The wider press, by contrast, seemed almost relieved to be given permission to write something warm instead of something cautious, and for a week or so afterward, Harrogate found itself the subject of an entirely different kind of coverage than it had grown accustomed to that autumn. Pieces about Morwenna's 9 quiet years of devotion to a nursery trust she had never once put her own name on, about a guard's split-second instinct to protect a small boy even at the cost of his own composure, about a 6-year-old's plain, disarming honesty on a reading room's front steps. I read almost none of it myself, having developed, over 2 difficult weeks, a healthy new caution around anything printed about the family I served, but Price read enough of it for the both of us, and reported back with the wry satisfaction of a man watching a stubborn problem finally resolve itself in the right direction. I was summoned, 5 days after the reading room visit, to a meeting I had genuinely not expected. King Alaric had returned from the coastal duchies 2 days earlier, and rather than send for a written report as I had half assumed he would, he asked to see me directly, in a modest private study I had passed 100 times on other errands and never once entered. I stood at attention just inside the door, uncertain of the protocol for a conversation like this one, until the king, seated behind a desk cluttered with the ordinary business of a working monarch rather than any ceremonial trapping, waved me toward a chair with an informality that startled me more than a summons would have. "Sit, Vale. I've had a great deal of formal reporting about you since I landed. I'd like a few minutes of something less formal before I close the file on it." I sat and told him when he asked, exactly what I had told Price and Locke and everyone else who had asked me over the preceding fortnight. The sun, the hedge, the shape I had seen and moved toward before I had finished deciding to move at all. Alaric listened the way I imagine he listened to a great many reports, without interrupting, his eyes steady on my face the entire time, and when I had finished he was quiet for a long moment before he spoke again. "My wife tells me," he said, "that she has never once doubted you, and that she would rather have a guard capable of moving 3 strides toward a mistaken shape than one who stands frozen wondering whether he's allowed to. I find I agree with her, though I confess it took me rather longer than her to arrive at the same conclusion, reading it all from a ship halfway across the strait with no one there to explain the tone of it to me." He allowed himself something close to a smile. "My grandson, meanwhile, has informed me at some length that you are, and I quote him precisely, the guard who thought a hug was a fight, and seems to consider this the single funniest thing to have happened at Harrogate in living memory. I would not be surprised if you hear about it from him for a good many years yet." I admitted somewhat ruefully that I already had twice in the days since. "Good," Alaric said. "Let him tease you for it. A household that can laugh at itself once the truth is finally settled is a healthier one than a household that never once allowed the truth to be questioned in the first place. I would rather my family be the kind that gets tangled up trying to comfort a crying child in front of half a dozen strangers with telephones and the kind, so carefully composed it never risks looking foolish for love. You did your part in all of this exactly as it needed doing, Vale, not the part where you moved too fast, which we have both agreed was a small and forgivable thing, but the part afterward, where you did not let your own doubt talk you out of a post you were plainly still fit to hold. That is worth rather more to me than a perfect 3 strides would have been. I left that study lighter than I had walked into it, and I have carried what he said that afternoon with me through every difficult season of duty since. Autumn settled properly over Harrogate in the weeks that followed, the long lawn's roses giving way to the last of the season's chrysanthemums, and life at the palace returned, as it always eventually does, to its ordinary rhythms, Torrin and Malin back at their lessons, Bram once again the small, cheerful center of whatever mischief the nursery could contain, Morwenna resuming her quiet, unphotographed visits to little larks, with nothing left hanging over them but the memory of a story that had, in the end, resolved exactly as the truth of it always deserved to. I still walk the loose perimeter I have always preferred, still catch scenes through gaps in hedges and pergolas with the sun sometimes wrong in my eyes, and I have learned in the time since to hold that first half-second of alarm a little more loosely than I once did, to let myself move, because 16 years of training will not simply stop asking that of me, but to trust, in the second half-second that always follows the first, that the shape in front of me deserves a proper look before it deserves a verdict. Bram still tells the story his own way at family gatherings, usually unprompted, usually to whichever new face happens to be standing nearest him, and he has never once told it the same way twice. Sometimes I am the hero who saved him from a terrible fight. Sometimes I am the guard who got it all wrong and had to be corrected by a 6-year-old. And once, memorably, at a birthday supper the following spring, I was simply Corin, who thought Grandmother Morwenna was going to steal me. Which is silly, because she already had me the whole time. She just wanted a bigger hug. Morwenna laughed harder at that version than I have ever seen her laugh at anything else, and reached across the table to catch Bram's hand in hers, and looked at me over the top of his head, with an expression that needed no further words attached to it at all. Some afternoons, watching the two of them together on that same lawn where it all began, I think that expression is the truest ending this particular story could ever have been given. Not a headline, not a correction printed 3 days too late and 3 paragraphs too thin, but simply a boy who was never once in any real danger, held, a little too enthusiastically, by 2 women who loved him exactly as much as they appeared to, from every angle that mattered.